I had been working cases that were about 30 years old. And in those 30-year-old cases, sure enough, someone makes a statement to an original investigator. And then 30 years go by, and guess what? That original investigator has now passed away. I have just simply a witness account. Sometimes the witness has passed away. So in order to piece it together, I've got to examine the accounts of witnesses from 30 years ago. And that involves a certain tool set. And that's the tool set that I try to use when examining the Gospels. Now, granted, it's a little bit different. We don't have access to those eyewitnesses anymore. So we have to do the best we can, given the antiquity of the statements. But I do think you can learn a lot. And there's a template that we use to evaluate eyewitnesses in court. So I simply thought, okay, this is how I would evaluate any eyewitness. Let me just try to evaluate the Gospel writers as though they're eyewitnesses. And I got involved in about a 4 or 5 months of just, I don't think I moved from the Gospels very often. I stayed in the Gospels. And the only time I would ever move from the Gospels would be if I thought there was something in a letter that might also describe. So when you've got Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, he's talking about the resurrection. There were some aspects in the letter that might help me understand what is being told in the first century about that event. So I stayed, though, for the most part, in the Gospels. And I really just camped there and picked them apart. Well, I mean, there's lots of little things that I wanted to test, and I was looking for a way to test them. I was looking for a way to use a more forensic approach. And one of the things that I had been involved in homicide investigations was something called forensic statement analysis. And that's where we have a guy who will commit a crime, and the next day you'll get him in custody, and you'll say, okay, I want you to take this piece of paper, just use one side, 24 lines, this ink pen. I want you to write everything you did yesterday from the time you got up in the morning to the time you went to bed. Just want you to write it all down. If you make a correction, you got to cross it out and make your correction. Then I examine that account, and I'm looking for his use of pronouns, his use of verb tense. I'm looking for his contraction of time, or his expansion of time. I'm looking for indicators that were deceptive language. I'm looking for anything in that statement that'll tell me whether he's involved, whether he's telling me the truth, and maybe what time of day he's trying to cover something or hide something from me. And so I'm using this process, which is really more an art than a science, called forensic statement analysis. And I thought I could probably use something similar to this with the Gospels, but I needed a claim to test. And about 2 or 3 months in, I was reading history on the Gospels, and I saw that Papias in the 1st century claimed that Mark's account was really from Peter, that Peter was sitting underneath Jesus, and everything that he learned in this time with Jesus, he then preached, and Mark faithfully recorded it, if not so much in terms of its order, he was careful about its accuracy. So I thought, well, I can test that with forensic statement analysis. Are there fingerprints of Peter in Mark's gospel? Are they in Mark's gospel in a way that they seem to be missing in the other gospels? So I spent several weeks just analyzing the Gospel of Mark, looking for the fingerprints of Peter to see if they were really there. And as I got done with that, I was really, I was pretty convinced that Peter was the source for Mark's information. It was just one more step in verifying these eyewitness accounts as just that, eyewitness accounts. So I think as I went through that process of digging, looking at language, looking at the template that I used to evaluate eyewitnesses, I became more comfortable and more confident that those were accurate, reliable eyewitness accounts. If you look at Mark's account, you'll see that there are places in Mark's account where Peter makes a lot of silly statements in the Gospels. We see him make silly statements all over the place. But when you look at Mark's version of those accounts, those are usually the least silly versions of Peter's statements. And you'll see Mark say things like, Peter said this silly thing, and all the other disciples agreed. So Mark is quick to kind of lump in the other disciples with Peter, always paying deference to Peter in a way that the other gospel writers just don't. And there's just so many small things like that pop out, details that only Peter would know about his hometown and his mother's residence in his hometown that really only appear in Mark, don't appear anywhere else. So there's a sense that there are important omissions which can be attributed to Peter. There are important inclusions that can be attributed to Peter. In the end, I was pretty convinced that Peter was the source for Mark. Look, when we're trying to verify an eyewitness account, we use what's called corroborative evidence. But corroborative evidence won't tell you the whole story. It'll just tell you a piece of the story. And from that, you infer the rest of the story. So for example, let's say I had a witness who said, I saw the robber come in, and he put his hand on the counter, and he pulled a gun out, and he told her to give me all your money. Now, if I'm looking to corroborate that eyewitness statement, how would I do it? Well, one thing I might do is go back and ask, well, is there a palm print on the counter in the direction that she said he placed his hand? If so, that would corroborate what she said, but it wouldn't tell you about if he had a gun, and it wouldn't tell you what he said. So in other words, it would corroborate one small piece from which you would infer the rest. It's called touch point corroboration. It just corroborates that one touch point, right? Well, what I was seeing as I examined through all the accounts in history about Jesus was the similar touch point corroboration. Historical writers would describe small aspects of Jesus' character or of Jesus' historical nature or of his existence in history, and they wouldn't describe all of it. They just described some small thing. And these were non-believers. These are people who really did not want to affirm the truth about Jesus, but were simply describing Jesus. And so what I saw repeatedly from the work of Thallus and Tacitus and Amar Bar Serapion, there's lots of other ancient writers, all I try to stay within the first 100 to 150 years. They all describe Jesus in a way as non-believers that provide us with pieces of touch point corroboration. I never, as an investigator, expect them to tell me everything about Jesus any more than that fingerprint can tell you everything about the actions of that robber. But they are going to tell me something about Jesus that I can use to infer to the larger account. I think that that kind of touch point corroboration should give us great confidence in the historical documents we call the Gospels, even though they're not going to mention or repeat every aspect of the Gospels. Well, so for example, if we were to take the writings of, let's say, Tacitus, Thallus, Phlegon, Bar Serapion, just a few of these historical writers in the first 100 years, let's say, and we were to make a list of everything they describe about Jesus, even though they're not believers, we would know a couple of things about Jesus if we lost all the other Christian documentation. If we lost the Gospels, but we still had the touch point corroboration of these few historical writers who are not Christians, you would know that Jesus lived. You would know when he was crucified, that he was crucified under the rule of Pontius Pilate. You would know that he had disciples who were persecuted afterwards, that the Jews were the cause, according to these historians, of his death. You would know a lot about Jesus' chronology, even though you'd lost every Christian document. So you'd know this man lived, who apparently was crucified under Pontius Pilate, in a certain region, caused by a certain group, Jewish group, that he was somebody who predicted things that actually came true, that someone who presented himself after his death alive to his disciples who claimed that they saw him. Now, none of these things necessarily mean it's true. And when we build a circumstantial case, what we do is we look at a lot of things that point to the same conclusion. They all point to the same conclusion. And so I looked at all of that touch point evidence and I said, wow, here again, we have more evidence that points to the same conclusion. The case gets stronger and stronger and stronger. One of the things I always doubted that the story of Jesus had been uncorrupted. I always figured, hey, that story has got to be full of mythological legend over the years. So it was helpful for me to see, well, John wrote this about Jesus, but then John had some pupils that he taught, Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp. And so he provided a story about Jesus that they affirmed and they repeated in their own writings. What do these guys say about Jesus? Because if the story is going to grow over time, maybe the first version of Jesus is much more benign. He's a simple teacher, didn't really rise from the dead, didn't really do any miracles, but he's a nice guy. No, it turns out from the very first description, as Papias and Polycarp affirm what John taught them, they describe Jesus as the miracle worker who rose from the dead, who claimed to be God, virgin birth. All the elements of the Gospels are present in the very first level of what I call the chain of custody as the story of Jesus moves down through time. He's not a legend that grows over time. The Jesus we know and love today has been the same, unchanged from all of antiquity. I was convinced that the Gospels were reliable before I really ever understood what the gospel of salvation was. My first step was to be convinced that this thing you're telling me in the Bible is true. And I had to take a path that was probably in some ways my own path because I was such an evidentialist to begin with. And so I eventually got to this place where I realized, hey, I'm committed to what this describes about Jesus, but this really shakes everything because this idea involves a lot. I'm committed to a reliable account that includes a description of a resurrection. How do you make sense of that under what I had prior to this, which was a very committed, philosophically natural worldview? Nothing supernatural was possible in my view of the world. So the idea that someone could rise from the dead is just, that's got to be mythology. That cannot be a reliable eyewitness account. That cannot be what actually happened. They've got to be mistaken in some way. So I went through a lot of time trying to run out all the other possible natural explanations for the resurrection before I got to the place where I said, hey, what's really keeping me from the one explanation that Christianity offers? What's keeping me is my presupposition against the supernatural. In other words, I've entered this with the bias I refuse to let go of. Yet everything points to this as the most reasonable conclusion, the most reasonable inference. But I won't accept it because I'm holding on to this bias that says nothing miraculous could ever happen, nothing supernatural could ever exist. And as I finally had to let go and realize that was what was keeping me, it wasn't the evidence. It wasn't that there wasn't enough evidence, it's that I didn't want there to be enough evidence. That was my problem. And a lot of that was rooted more in Jim wanting to be the God of Jim's world than wanting there to be another God who would be directing me, or another God would have something to say about how I was living. So I had to come to that conclusion and really think about, well, okay, and this is as I'm convinced now that this is a reliable account. And I remember talking to Susie about it and saying, well, what do you make of the cross, though? I don't get it. What's the cross about? I mean, I know what happened. I know that it's true, but I couldn't put my trust in it yet because I didn't quite understand. And that's when it was important for me to move beyond the Gospels into the letters, and then to go back and look closely at what Jesus was telling me about my condition, because it's all there in the Gospels, but I have been looking at the Gospels in a particular way for their reliability. Now it was time to look at them and ask, what is Jesus saying about my need? And that was the biggest transition for me. That's when I moved from belief that it's true to belief in it as true. Taking that additional step required me to know what was my need. I had to see myself clearly. This is true. You know what's amazing to me? I would have said that Jesus was the kind of guy who wants me just to buy in. But that's not what the Gospels demonstrate. And that's one of the things I was really struck by as I read the Gospels, that Jesus was constantly saying things like in John where he'll say, hey, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, at least believe in the evidence of these miracles I've been showing you. And then he spends 40 days with the disciples after the resurrection in Acts 1, where all he's doing is giving them many convincing proofs. When Thomas has got a doubt, he says, touch me. I mean, this to me was somebody who had a really high value in skeptics like me who needed to see it, who needed some a foundation, an evidential foundation for what they believe. I was impressed with the level of response that Jesus always provided, an evidential level of response. You know, when John had real doubts, John the Baptist, and sent his disciples, hey, what do you think? You know, ask him, is he the one who's supposed to be the guy? I'm not sure. Apparently he's got some doubts. And what does Jesus do? He performs miracles and then tells them, go back and tell them what you just saw. So he's always responding by saying, well, let me show you. And that's what I needed. I needed to see it. If nothing else, to see it on the pages of the testimony. What I love about Christianity is that it's falsifiable. What I mean is, it could be falsifiable. It's not false. But the fact that it's an event that occurred in history that we can examine, an event that took place in the past, that means I can falsify it or verify it. If it's just a set of proverbial statements from a wise sage, how could I ever falsify or verify that? But this is more than that. Yeah, he said a lot of wise things, but he did things in the past that if they didn't happen, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we're to be pitied. If the resurrection didn't really occur, we've been lying to you. That's what Paul says. And so this was intriguing to me because it was a claim not just about some wisdom from the ancient past, but a claim about an event that either occurred or didn't occur in the ancient past. And that was something I could test. And that was something that Jesus constantly said, test it. If you don't believe what I'm telling you, look what I just did. And that to me was a very powerful part of Christianity that I really just didn't realize existed until I read the Gospels. That came to life for me. And so like C.S. Lewis said, this is true. This is the most important truth you'll ever know. It's not just moderately true. This is the kind of truth claim that's either false, get away from it, or if it's true, you got to submit everything to this. So my sense of it was that if this was true, this was about to change everything. And it was going to mean a complete repurposing. Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things about submitting is I'm not submitting to the facts of Jesus' life. I'm really submitting to what I now understand about my own need. That's where, to me, where the submission begins. It's not that, okay, I got these facts down and I now believe these facts. I mean, that was important, a step in this process. But submission for me was all about realizing I'm not God, and realizing that, man, I'm a mess. And there's a lot about my life that I would like to change, a lot that I'm not proud of, a lot that I need forgiveness for. And I think what happens is you might read through the Gospels the first time and come to a factual conclusion about what the Gospels say about Jesus. But as you read through the second time, you start to see yourself in there. And you start to hear Jesus' words are really directed at me. And when that happens, now it's humbling. It's very humbling to see that, okay, I believe Jesus is the guy. I believe Jesus really lived. I believe he is who he said he was. Well, now what does he say about me? What does he say about all of us? What does he say about our need? And I was much like those religious folks who came up to Jesus who thought they were all tidy on the outside, who were really not that tidy on the inside. But they had kind of held their world together and had behaved a certain way, as if they were in control of their eternal destiny, as if they were God. And that was me. When inside there was a lot of stuff that, if I was really honest with myself, was not pretty. And I never, before becoming a Christian, I never had the power to admit to any of that stuff. I would have fought with you if you'd have claimed that I was a certain way or had a certain need. I would have said, no way, that's not me.